In the winter of 2007, a man named Dale Foss drove a white NC Cooperative Extension pickup down a gravel road in Caldwell County, North Carolina, climbed out in his clean company boots, walked the length of a fence line heaped with pale sawdust, and told the farmer standing there that what he was looking at was, in his professional judgment, a compost problem, not a crop. Dale was the regional extension director out of Lenoir, and he held a master's degree in agricultural systems from NC State, and he meant it kindly. He had a projection in his clipboard folder showing that specialty mushroom production at commercial scale required climate-controlled grow rooms, sterilized substrate, positive pressure air filtration, and refrigerated shipping infrastructure. The numbers did not work any other way. He told Harlan Mast that he was glad the furniture plant next door had found a place to dump its waste, and that the row crop transition assistance program was still accepting applications through March. And then he got back in the pickup and drove away. 11 years later, in the fall of 2018, Harlan's daughter Nora read a number off a spreadsheet at the kitchen table in that same farmhouse in Caldwell County, and Harlan did not say anything for a long time. The number was $74,200. That was the gross revenue from 3,400 linear feet of outdoor mushroom substrate rows running along the fence line where Dale Fossey had once stood and delivered his diagnosis. 0 chemical inputs, 0 refrigerated infrastructure, 0 purchased substrate. The raw material had been arriving at that fence free of charge for 14 years. This is the story of what Harlan Mast built from what a furniture plant threw away, and why it took a certified expert, a drought, and one very patient border collie to convince anyone it was real. If you have ever watched a system discard something and felt certain the system was wrong about its value, leave a thought below. The comment below this video has seen more than a few people who know exactly what Harlan felt standing at that fence. Harlan was 58 years old in 2007, and he was known in the county for 2 things: a quietness that people sometimes mistook for slowness, and an understanding of wood rot that bordered on the uncanny. He had grown up on the same 22 acres in Caldwell County, the son of Eldon Mast, who had farmed tobacco and hardwood timber and spent his evenings keeping a close-written notebook on the fruiting behavior of wild fungi in the second-growth forest at the back of the property. Eldon had died in 1998, leaving the notebook and the land to Harlan, and Harlan had done with both what Eldon would have recognized. He kept them close and read them carefully. Eldon was a particular kind of farmer, the kind that the county's professional agricultural apparatus had little framework for. He paid his tobacco allotment dues and attended the extension meetings and ran his timber operation with the attentiveness of a man who understood that a woodlot is a crop like any other. But his truest interest, the one he pursued without any expectation that anyone would find it useful, was the science he had arrived at by feel and by watching. He had discovered that certain organic material, in the right conditions of shade and moisture and temperature, became the medium for a form of agriculture older than any extension service ever imagined. He called mushroom fruiting occasions in his notebook, and he spent 30 years recording them with the same seriousness that a surveyor maps terrain. He noted the date and the species and the substrate. He noted whether the logs the mushrooms fruited from were oak or poplar or hickory, how long they had been fallen, how deep the shade overhead, whether it had rained heavily in the preceding week or merely stayed humid and gray. He noted which fruiting occasions persisted across multiple seasons and which exhausted quickly. He was not cataloging a hobby. He was building a database, in his slow and unannounced way, of what the specific ecology at the back of his specific Caldwell County property knew how to do without being asked. Harlan had grown up accompanying him on those backfield walks. He was the kind of boy who did not ask many questions, but paid close attention, and he absorbed what Eldon showed him the way ground absorbs rain, without ceremony. By the time he was 12, he could identify the fruiting species Eldon tracked most carefully and name the substrate conditions they required. By the time he was 20, he could have written the notebook's conclusions himself, though he would not have thought to call them conclusions, because in the Mast household, they were simply what was true. The furniture plant, Aldred Manufacturing, had been operating on the adjacent parcel since the late 1980s, cutting oak and poplar chair components and running the byproduct sawdust out a side conveyor into a dump pile that had, by 2000, grown into a low ridge along the common fence. In 2003, the company switched to a larger capacity conveyor, and the pace of the dumping increased. The loads came 3 and 4 times a week, pale and fragrant, oak and poplar dust mixing in rough windrows along the fence wire. Harlan received no notice about this. The Aldred plant manager had assumed correctly that a farmer with 22 acres of his own had little grounds to complain about sawdust, and had made no inquiry. Harlan watched the pale windrows grow, and he did not complain, because Eldon's notebook had told him something about what oak and poplar sawdust could do in the right conditions, and he was thinking about it in the careful and unhurried way he thought about most things. Let me tell you about what those notebooks said, because this is where the story really begins. Eldon Mast had spent 30 years logging what he called fruiting occasions in the woods at the back of the Caldwell County property. He was not a scientist. He was a farmer who had grown up eating wild chanterelles and hen-of-the-woods from the forest floor, and who paid close attention to where those mushrooms appeared and what conditions preceded them. What he recorded, entry by entry across 3 decades, was a pattern that any mycologist would have recognized as an observation of substrate biology. The fungi he tracked most carefully were the wood decomposers, species that fruited from fallen oak and poplar logs, from old sawmill waste piles left in the tree line, from butt ends of timber stacked too long in the shade. He noted the moisture content of the material when fruiting occurred. He noted the time of year, the temperature, the relative cover overhead. He wrote, in a 1979 entry that Harlan had read many times, that the mushrooms do not want soil. They want wood that is already giving up. Harlan had grown up with that notebook. When the sawdust ridge at the fence line reached 4 feet high in 2003, he retrieved it from the shelf where it had sat since Eldon's death and read it through again. Then he called a mail-order spawn supplier in Boone called Blue Ridge Spawn Company and ordered his first bags of oyster mushroom mycelium. The mechanism Harlan had worked out from the notebook was simple enough to explain, though the Extension Service would have insisted it was too simple to work at any scale. Oyster and shiitake mushrooms are wood decay fungi. They do not need sterilized laboratory substrate. What they need is a correct moisture environment, a manageable competing organism load, and a carbon-rich wood fiber base that their mycelium can colonize before anything else does. Harlan's method addressed each condition in sequence. He mixed the fresh sawdust with wheat bran at roughly 9 parts. Sawdust to 1 part bran, correcting the nitrogen balance so the spawn had fuel for rapid colonization. He tested moisture by a squeeze. The material should just release a few drops of water from a closed fist, no more, which put it at roughly 60% by weight. He inoculated in breathable grow bags, tied them off, and laid them in shaded outdoor rows covered by green shade cloth that blocked direct sunlight and reduced the ambient spore pressure from competing organisms in open air. The colonization period ran 6 to 8 weeks, long enough for the oyster mycelium to thread through every pocket of the substrate before anything else could establish a foothold. Then the fall temperature drops, and the humidity of the NC Piedmont foothills did the rest. The bags fruited. They fruited again, and then again. A well-built substrate row would produce for 3 to 4 years before the wood fiber was exhausted, and spent substrate went directly back to the garden beds as amendment. He ran his first full outdoor row in 2004, 40 feet long. He built it in late March, filling and inoculating 12 bags over a long weekend, working in the shade of the hemlock row with a 5-gallon bucket of the brand mix and the oyster spawn bags he had received from Blue Ridge Spawn Company packed in a cooler. The work was slow in particular, each bag filled to a specific density, each one tied off and laid in position along the prepared ground. The shade cloth staked and weighted so that no direct afternoon sun reached the row. He watered it twice a week through April and into May. He watched the bags through June and July without seeing anything that would have encouraged a conventional farmer, only pale off-white substrate going slightly darker at the seams where the first mycelium threads were beginning to thread through. In August, the colonization was visible, if you looked closely, white filaments woven through the oak dust in a pattern that Eldon had described in a 1974 notebook entry as looking like the inside of a good cloud. In late October, after the first sustained cool front moved through and the humidity came up, the first clusters pinned at the bag openings, 5 species-correct oyster mushroom fruiting bodies, pale gray, the gills running down the short stem. He cut them with a knife and put them on the kitchen scale. 8 pounds. He drove them to the produce stand in Connolly Springs in a cardboard flat lined with wax paper. The stand operator, a woman named Prilla Hoke, who had been selling produce at that location since the mid-1980s, held a cluster to the light and said she had never carried mushrooms before, but that she would try a flat and see what happened. She sold out in 2 days. She called Harlan and asked if he had more. The answer, in time, would be yes. By 2007, when Dale Foss made his visit, Harlan had extended the substrate rows to roughly 800 linear feet, running parallel to the fence line, shaded by the fence itself on the south side and by a row of established hemlocks on the north. He had added shiitake to the oyster variety, running shiitake bags deeper into the shade where the temperature modulation was more stable through summer. He had worked out, through Eldon's framework and 4 seasons of adjustment, that the primary advantage of outdoor passive production was not just the free substrate, but the microclimatic stability the fence and tree cover provided. The sawdust ridge itself acted as a moisture reservoir. Wood fiber holds 3 to 4 times its dry weight in water. When a dry week came, the rows maintained their humidity longer than any exposed field crop could. When a wet week came, the bags drained freely, and the mycelium flushed in the spike of humidity that followed. The system worked because Harlan had chosen a piece of ground that the method fit, and the method had been handed to him by a man who had spent 30 years watching the same ground produce mushrooms from the same class of material without anyone's help at all. Dale Foss had not asked about any of that. He had a county farm agent's report in his folder characterizing Harlan's operation as an experimental alternative production system, and he had arrived with the practiced efficiency of a man who had conducted dozens of these site assessments across Caldwell and Burke and McDowell counties and knew approximately what he would find before he arrived. He walked the length of the rows, He noted the absence of a climate-controlled structure. He noted the breathable bags and the shade cloth and the sawdust substrate. He looked for the refrigerated staging area that commercial mushroom production required at scale and found instead a wooden-sided table under the hemlock tree with a scale and some wax paper flats. He wrote something on his clipboard. Then he told Harlan that what he was looking at was, in his professional judgment, a compost problem, not a crop. He said the product itself might be sound, but without sterilized substrate preparation and temperature-controlled post-harvest handling, the operation could not be characterized as a sustainable commercial venture. He said the grant programs for specialty crop development were oriented toward producers who had the infrastructure to meet food safety certification thresholds, and he doubted the outdoor passive model would qualify. He said all of this without any unkindness in his voice. He meant to be useful. Harlan listened. He thanked Dale for the visit. He went back to work. By the time Gary Tench signed his first specialty vegetable contract in 2008, the comparison between the two paths was already being quietly written into the land. Gary farmed the 40-acre parcel one field over, and he was a careful and well-regarded operator who had followed the Extension Service's tobacco transition guidance exactly as recommended. He put 14 acres into contracted squash and green beans for a regional grocery cooperative, borrowed $87,000 for a refrigerated packing shed and a specialized harvesting attachment, and ran his first full season in 2009 with results that looked, on paper, like exactly what the model promised. He cleared a working margin and showed it at the Caldwell County Farm Bureau meeting in January of 2010, and 3 of his neighbors nodded with the respect of men watching someone do a thing correctly. Harlan was not at that meeting. He was at home working through an expansion plan, running the row count to 3,200 linear feet by spring. In 2012, Dale Fossey returned to the Mass property with a university extension intern who was documenting alternative production systems for a county profile. The intern photographed the rows. She asked questions about humidity management and substrate preparation, and Harlan answered them plainly. Dale stood to the side of the conversation with his clipboard, and then made the observation that what Harlan had out there was still, at its core, a compost problem, not a crop. He said it without edge. He believed it. The intern wrote something in her notebook, and then looked at the rows for a long time, and Harlan saw her looking, and did not say anything about it. That same summer, Nora Mass came home from her first year at NC State's food science program and walked the substrate rows with her father and told him, in the gentle voice of a young woman who did not want to hurt him, that he could not inoculate outdoor substrate without contamination protocols. She said the competing organism load in open air would overwhelm the spawn before it could colonize. She said she had read the literature. She was not wrong that sterilization was the standard approach for commercial indoor production. She was wrong about what the shade cloth, the moisture management, and the speed of colonization were doing together at that specific fence line in that specific microclimate, and she had not yet seen it run through a full season. Harlan listened to her. He handed her the wheat bran bag and showed her the squeeze test and told her to come back in 8 weeks. She came back. The bags had colonized clean. She crouched in the row for a long time and looked at the mycelium threading through the oak fiber and did not say the word sterilization again. The years between 2013 and 2016 built on one another the way good soil builds. Harlan extended the rows again in 2014 to 3,400 linear feet, which was the length his ground could support under adequate shade and his labor alone. He began selling to a natural food cooperative in Morganton that year adding a second revenue stream alongside the produce stand and making the first entry into a market that cared about provenance and growing method in a way that the conventional produce chain never had. The co-op buyers asked about his substrate preparation and whether he used any pesticide inputs, and Harlan said no to the second question and explained the first, and they put his mushrooms on the same shelf as the local honey and the small batch preserves from the Burke County operations. The price per pound was better than the produce stand by $1.25. Nora came home between semesters and began keeping her own substrate log alongside Eldon's, dating entries and tracking yield by row section and fruiting cycle, building the kind of quantitative record that a food science-trained mind wanted to see, and that Eldon's intuitive notes had never quite provided. She ran yield per linear foot calculations and plotted them by row age and substrate batch, and what she found was that the rows built in years 3 through 5 of a given substrate batch consistently outperformed the first-year rows because the mycelium network had fully colonized and the competing organism pressure had been thoroughly displaced. She wrote this up in a brief summary and left it on the kitchen table. Harlan read it. He did not say anything, which was how he indicated that she had gotten it right. The two notebooks lived on the same shelf from that point forward. Eldon's cloth-covered and soft at the spine from years of handling, Nora's a standard composition book with her name and the start date on the inside cover. Gary Tench, in those same years, was managing a situation that looked successful from the road, but felt increasingly fragile in the accounting ledger. His squash and green bean contract had run for 5 seasons, and 5 seasons had been enough to reveal the structural instability that the extension model's projection had not modeled for. The grocery cooperative, responding to its own buyers' requirements, had tightened the Grade A uniformity specification in 2015 in a way that Gary's open field production could not consistently meet. Weather variation, insect pressure, and the inherent variability of field-grown vegetables meant that in any given harvest week, 10 to 15% of his output fell below grade. Those rejections came back at Gary's cost, absorbed into an operation that was also servicing the $87,000 in equipment debt from 2008 at a commercial rate that had not moved favorably. He replaced a broken harvesting attachment in the spring of 2015 for $14,000 and financed it against the contract's projected future income. He told the Farm Bureau in January of 2016 that it had been a tight year, but the contract was solid. He believed this when he said it. He was a careful farmer who had done what the system told him to do, and the system had not told him that the cooperative's purchasing priorities were subject to a restructuring review that was already underway in the corporate office in Charlotte. The contract was not solid, which brings us to the summer of 2017, because this is when the landscape settled the question that Dale Foss and the extension model and Gary's careful by-the-book operation had all been carrying as an assumption about who was doing a real thing and who was managing a compost problem. Western North Carolina ran dry in July of 2017 in a way that county agents would later describe as the worst soil moisture deficit in recorded Caldwell County history. The rain gauge at the Lenoir weather station recorded 0.3 inches for the entire month of July against a 30-year monthly average of 4 inches. The temperature ran 8 to 11 degrees above normal for 3 consecutive weeks. The soil in the county's open agricultural fields dried past field capacity deficit by the 10th of July and then kept drying. Squash plants need consistent ground moisture to develop the intercellular pressure that carries water and sugars into the growing fruit. Without that moisture, the plants close their stomata to conserve what little water the roots can find, and when the stomata close, the fruit stops sizing, and the skin goes waxy and pale, and the grade falls below commercial threshold faster than any market can account for. Gary Tench watched this happen across his 14-acre block in the second week of July 2017. He ran his irrigation system until the well pressure dropped, and then he ran it again, but the evaporation rate in the heat exceeded what the drip lines could replace in the hardpan soil. 6.4 acres of squash, desiccated before August reached its first week. The green beans held somewhat longer, but the cooperative required a minimum squash-to-bean ratio in his supply contract, and when the squash number fell, the whole agreement became technically non-compliant. The Regional Grocery Cooperative terminated the supply agreement on the 14th of September in a 3-paragraph letter that expressed regret and referenced force majeure and the cooperative's own obligations to its retail buyers. Gary had read that letter at the kitchen table of his farmhouse, and then he had walked out to the packing shed and stood in the refrigerated unit and listened to the compressor run, building cold for a crop that was not coming. He owed $61,000 on the shed and the harvesting equipment at that point, spread across 2 notes at different maturities. The refrigerated unit would run its compressor all winter, $52 a month in electricity, cooling nothing. At the Mass property fence line, the substrate rows did not fail. The sawdust ridge that Aldred Manufacturing had been depositing along that fence since 2003 was, by the physics of wood fiber, a drought buffer. Oak and poplar sawdust holds 3 to 4 times its own dry weight in water, and a 6-foot ridge of it represents an enormous reservoir of moisture that releases slowly into the surrounding air as ambient humidity drops. While Gary's bare field soil cracked in the July heat, and the squash plants flagged and went waxy, the substrate rows under Harlan's shade cloth maintained a humidity microclimate that the surrounding dry air could not fully displace. The shade cloth reduced the rate of evaporation. The hemlock row on the north side provided additional buffer against the desiccating southwest wind that had been the instrument of the drought's damage. Harlan walked the rows in the hottest days of July and squeeze-tested the substrate and found it at 58%, within range holding. The fall 2017 oyster fruiting on those rows was the strongest Harlan had recorded in 14 seasons. The temperature drop in late September triggered a flush that covered the bag openings in thick, pale gray clusters, more than in any previous fall, because the humidity that the sawdust had been banking through the dry summer was releasing now into a temperature differential that the mycelium read as the ideal fruiting signal. The drought that had ended Gary's contract had concentrated and amplified Harlan's harvest. He brought in 61 pounds in the first October week alone, and the produce stand in Connolly Springs and the Morganton Co-op took everything he had. There was a county agricultural meeting in November of 2017 where Dale Foss made a brief assessment of the drought's impact on the county's farm sector. He noted that the season had revealed once again the resilience of well-designed commercial operations versus what he called peripheral production experiments. He used the phrase, a compost problem, not a crop. He did not know at that moment what had happened at the mast fence line that fall. He would find out. Harlan was sitting in the third row at that meeting. Remy, the tricolor border collie who had been sleeping at Harlan's feet in the truck since he was a pup in 2012, waited in the cab. Harlan listened to Dale's assessment without expression. Then he drove home. In the spring of 2018, a woman named Britta Sondergaard found her way to the Caldwell County Farmers Market on a Tuesday morning in April, with the specific intention of sourcing local mushrooms for her restaurant in Asheville. She was the executive chef at a well-regarded farm-to-table establishment in the River Arts District, and she had been buying commodity oyster mushrooms from a commercial distributor in Charlotte that she found technically acceptable and gastronomically dull. She had heard through the regional food sourcing network that someone in Caldwell County was running outdoor substrate production, and she drove the 40 minutes east on a weekday because she preferred to make sourcing decisions in person and in the morning when the product was freshest. She found Harlan's table on the outer row of the market, recognizable by the absence of branded packaging and signage. He had brought 2 cardboard flats of oyster clusters and 1 flat of shiitake caps laid out on the table under a piece of burlap. The oyster clusters were pearl gray, the caps still curved inward at the edges, which is the correct stage for picking if you want flavor and shelf life both. Britta picked up a cluster and turned it over and examined the gills, which ran down the short stem in a tight, even pattern that indicated a slow, cool fruiting rather than the fast, forced flush of a climate-controlled indoor operation. She pressed the flesh between her fingers and noted the resistance. She brought it close and inhaled. She stood like that for a moment. "Where are you sourcing these?" she said. Harlan told her his property. Caldwell County, about 40 minutes east. She was quiet for another moment, looking at the cluster in her hand. A chef learns to recognize the specific quality of a product that has developed in an unhurried way in conditions that match what the organism is built for. The flavor compounds that make a high-quality oyster mushroom worth cooking are concentrated in the fruiting body during the pinning phase, and pinning that happens slowly in outdoor temperature conditions with natural humidity cycling produces a different compound ratio than pinning that is rushed in a controlled environment. Britta could not have explained this in the conversation in front of a market table, and Harlan would not have used those words regardless, but they were both responding to the same thing in the clusters she was holding. "How much can you put me in for weekly?" she said. He told her 40 pounds was a comfortable weekly commitment, mixed oyster and shiitake, and that his availability ran from September through April, with a summer gap because July and August were too warm for reliable fruiting at his outdoor row setup. She did not negotiate the price. She said September through April was a reasonable sourcing window for her menu cycle. She asked when he could start and wrote her number on the back of a business card from her shirt pocket and set it on the table. Harlan put it in his breast pocket. She bought both oyster flats from him on the spot at his posted price, loaded them into a cooler in the back of her car, and left. She did not look back at the table because she had what she came for. That was in April of 2018. By November, Nora had been running the substrate records and the revenue log for a full calendar year. She sat at the kitchen table one evening in early December and added the last quarterly figure on her laptop and then looked at the total for a long time before she said it out loud. $74,200. She said it again quietly, because the number deserved the repetition. Harlan was sitting across from her. Remy was at his boot, the way he always was in the evenings, his chin on the linoleum and his eyes half open. Harlan looked at the number on Nora's screen and then looked out the window at the fence line and did not say anything. The Sawdust Ridge was there in the dark as it had been since 2003. Aldred's conveyor had been running long enough that the ridge was now 6 feet high in the middle and had flattened an old fence post in 2 places, bending the wire out toward the road. The plant had never once asked Harlan if the dumping was acceptable. He had never told them it was welcome. $74,200 from 3,400 linear feet of outdoor substrate rows, 0 chemical inputs, 0 refrigerated infrastructure, 0 purchased substrate. Britta Sondergaard's 40 pounds per week at a price Harlan had set at $9 a pound for the oysters and $11 for the shiitake, running September through April. The Morganton Co-op at their price. The Connolly Springs stand at its price. No grants, no infrastructure loans, no cooperative contracts subject to restructuring. The number landed in that kitchen the way numbers do when they arrive at the precise intersection of patience and proof, heavy and quiet and without any ornamentation. Harlan sat with it. Outside the window, the Sawdust Ridge sat with it, too, still accumulating, still being delivered by a furniture plant that was still, after 14 years, charging nothing for the material it was depositing at the fence of its neighbor. Nora closed the laptop, and they sat in the kitchen a while. Remy shifted at Harlan's boot and resettled. Dale Fossey heard the revenue figure in January of 2019, passed through the county extension network by a farm agent who had also heard it and found it either implausible or worth investigating. And the detail that stopped Dale was not the number itself, but the note about 0 refrigerated infrastructure. He had built his professional assessment of the massed operation on the certainty that post-harvest mushroom handling without temperature control was a food safety and quality liability that would preclude any sustained commercial relationship. The Asheville restaurant purchase order complicated that certainty considerably. He drove out to the Mass property in February of 2019 without calling ahead, which he almost never did, and he parked at the edge of the gravel and walked down to the fence line where the substrate rows ran. He came without a clipboard. He walked the rows with Harlan for close to an hour. He looked at the bag construction and the shade cloth installation and the substrate layup. He looked at the new bags Nora had inoculated in January, already showing the early white threads of colonization through the breathable fabric. At the end of the walk, he stood at the center of the row and was quiet for a moment. And then he said, in a voice that was quieter than the one he had used on the 3 previous occasions he had characterized this fence line, "Show me how you're setting the moisture." Harlan showed him. The squeeze test, the wheat bran ratio, the bag layup sequence, the shade cloth angle, and the reason for it. Dale watched and listened, the way a man listens when a system he trusted has been contradicted in front of his eyes by 14 seasons of outdoor substrate and a revenue figure that could not be argued with, carefully and without any argument. By spring of 2019, 3 neighboring families had come to the Mass property to learn the inoculation process. They had been among the farm's hardest hit by the 2017 drought, and they came with the particular humility of people who have watched the correct path demonstrate itself on the adjacent acreage and need no further convincing that the conventional path they had followed has exposed them in a way they cannot afford to repeat. Gary Tench was among them. He sat in the second row of the informal session. Nora ran in the barn, a folding table at the front with bags of substrate, and spawn laid out in order of assembly, Eldon's notebook photocopied and stapled and distributed, along with Nora's yield tables. And Gary asked careful questions about the wheat-bran ratio and the correct moisture feel for the squeeze test, and did not refer to his debt or his packing shed or the terminated contract. Harlan, who stood at the side of the room throughout, did not refer to them either. Gary had done what the best available guidance told him to do. The best available guidance had been wrong in the particular way that confident institutional knowledge is often wrong at exactly the time horizon that mattered. He was not responsible for the model he had trusted, and he was entitled to learn a different one. Nora formalized the inoculation training over that spring and ran it again in the fall, adding a session on seasonal substrate preparation and one on shiitake flush management for the producers who had committed to that variety. She kept both notebooks updated as the training sessions produced new questions and the answers to those questions produced refinements. Eldon's notebook she transcribed entry by entry into a digital archive that spring, preserving the handwriting in photographs and the content in text, so that the 30 years of observation Eldon had put into that cloth-covered volume could not be lost to a kitchen fire or a flooded cellar. Her own notebook she dated and annotated with yield data and seasonal notes, and the specific questions that the neighboring farm's adoption had raised, building a record that Eldon would have recognized as the continuation of the same project he had begun in the woods at the back of the same property in the early 1970s. The chain had not broken. It had just been extended by a daughter who had once told her father that outdoor inoculation without sterilization protocols could not work, and had then watched the quiet evidence of 14 seasons prove otherwise. Dale Fosse attended the fall training. He did not speak during it. At the end, he shook Nora's hand and told her the documentation she was building would be worth more than the substrate rows themselves. She thanked him. She suspected he was right. Harlan declined the inquiries that came after Nora's training sessions became, through word of mouth and one short piece in a regional agricultural newsletter, a small but known thing in the county. He was asked twice if he wanted to scale the operation, first by an agricultural investor, and then by a food business incubator out of Boone that had heard about the zero-input model. He said no to both. 22 acres was what the ground was, and 3,400 linear feet was what the shade cover and the fence line could support, and he had no desire to build a structure or hire labor or refrigerate anything. The oyster mushrooms that Britta picked up from him in Asheville did not require a different facility. They required the same fence line, the same shade cloth, and the same sawdust that Aldred's conveyors deposited, season by season, without knowing what it was building. Remy went gray around the muzzle in 2021 and slept more and moved closer to Harlan's feet in the evenings, and Nora came back to Caldwell County full-time that year, finished with the work she had gone to Raleigh to complete. She said the substrate log and Eldon's notebook and the training program were enough of a reason. Harlan did not argue with her. He had learned, watching his father watch the forest floor for 30 years, that the knowledge worth keeping is the kind that attaches to a particular piece of ground and does not travel well by itself. It needs someone to carry it forward who has stood in the specific shade of the specific hemlocks and felt the specific humidity of the specific October mornings when the rows pin out their first clusters of the season. Nora had done that enough years now that the knowledge was hers, not just a transcript of Eldon's and Harlan's. There are two ways of knowing a piece of land. The first way is broad and confident and moves in straight lines from data to projection. It counts acres and inputs and yields per standardized unit and arrives at a number that tells you what the land should produce in the conditions most likely to obtain. The second way is narrow and slow and does not generalize. It lives in the specific. It lives in the moisture of this particular substrate at this particular depth under this particular shade in this particular season. It accumulates not as a model, but as a record, entry after entry, and it can be wrong about many things while being completely and specifically right about the one piece of ground it has been reading for decades. Dale Fosse was not a bad man. He was a good faith professional who had spent a career applying the first kind of knowing, and he was right about the majority of the operations he advised. What he could not see at the massed fence line was that the sawdust the furniture plant dumped there for 14 years was not, in the logic of Harlan's inherited knowledge, a liability or a nuisance or a compost problem. It was the substrate. It had always been the substrate. He had looked at a pile of someone else's industrial waste and seen disorder. Harlan had read his father's notebook and seen the beginning of a growing cycle. The difference between those two readings is not a matter of education or diligence or goodwill. It is a matter of which question you ask first. Dale asked what the standard conditions required and measured what was missing. Harlan asked what the ground already had and built from there. What the system calls waste depends entirely on what the system is designed to see. A furniture plant throws sawdust at a fence because sawdust costs money to haul and someone else's field is free. A man who knows what wood does when it is given moisture and shade and time does not see waste at a fence. He sees substrate. He sees 6 to 8 weeks of colonization. He sees 3 to 4 years of harvest from each row. He sees 40 pounds a week for an Asheville restaurant, and a number in December that 2 generations of patient attention to one piece of ground finally produced in full. The notebook is still on the shelf in the Caldwell County farmhouse. Eldon's entries in the front, Nora's in the back, and a gap in the middle that belongs to Harlan's years, which he recorded not in writing but in the rows themselves, in 14 seasons of outdoor substrate laid along a fence that a furniture plant built for him without meaning to. Remy sleeps at Harlan's boot in the evenings. The sawdust keeps coming. What is rigid breaks. What belongs to the ground endures.